"Did you hear that crack?" someone shouted, and then the whole bridge groaned like an old tree snapping in a storm before it collapsed into the lake with a splash so loud car alarms went off on the other side of the cul-de-sac. For a moment, nobody moved. The lake rippled, boards bobbed like broken teeth, and the smell of splintered cedar hit the air. Neighbors gathered along the shoreline, whispering, clutching coffee mugs, phones out, eyes wide. It felt like the final act of a crime none of us asked to witness. I remember one woman gasping, "But that was our bridge," like she'd just lost a family heirloom, and in a way, she had. The bridge wasn't just wood, it was a landmark, a shortcut, a gathering place, and thanks to Karen, it was gone. Karen, of course, wasn't standing with us. She was up on her porch, arms crossed, looking smug in her pastel cardigan, like she'd just pulled off a heroic deed. 2 weeks earlier, she'd marched into the HOA meeting with a folder labeled "Safety First," and insisted the bridge was a ticking time bomb, just waiting for a lawsuit. Nobody voted on it. Nobody even asked her to look into it. She simply announced that the board, meaning herself and her loyal VP, who never spoke above a whisper, had approved demolition. I'd known something was off the second I got the notice taped to my door. Effective immediately, the Lakewood footbridge will be decommissioned and removed for safety reasons. That's HOA code for Karen didn't like it, so it's gone. The rest of us? We were supposed to smile, wave, and say thank you for saving us from ourselves. The thing is, that bridge wasn't just wood and nails. It connected the main cul-de-sac to the lake cottages, the ones you couldn't reach without circling a half-mile around through the county road. Every summer, kids used to race across it barefoot with popsicles dripping down their arms. Teenagers snuck out to carve initials into the railings. On cool evenings, some of us dragged lawn chairs out to the middle, dangling fishing lines and trading gossip while bats skimmed the water. It was our heartbeat. So why did Karen really want it gone? That was the whisper echoing around every driveway. At barbecues, people leaned in and murmured, "She hated that people had bonfires out there," or "She wasn't invited to poker night on the bridge." My favorite theory came from Mrs. Henderson, who swore Karen once fell in after one too many Chardonnay spritzers and never forgave the planks for wobbling. The official story was safety. Karen even brought a contractor's letter to the meeting, a single sheet of paper with the words "Structural Concerns," printed in bold, no signature, no company logo. When I asked to see the full report, she sniffed and said, "You don't need to see the details. That's why you elected me." Elected. Funny word, considering she'd been appointed when the last president moved to Florida and nobody else wanted the headache. But she clung to that title like it was her royal crown. The demolition itself was almost cinematic in its cruelty. One Saturday morning, while half the neighborhood was still asleep, a work crew rolled in with chainsaws and a winch. By the time most people realized what was happening, half the boards were already piled on the shore. Children cried, dogs barked at the machinery, and Karen stood there with a clipboard, lips pursed, muttering, "Safety, safety, safety," like a prayer. I confronted her right there. "You didn't even let us vote on this," I said. Karen tilted her head, eyes sharp behind her oversized sunglasses. "Do you really want to be liable when someone falls through that rotting wood? Because I don't. And as HOA president, I'm protecting all of you." "Protecting us from community?" I shot back. "From joy?" She just smiled. The kind of smile that said she was enjoying every ounce of the power. But here's the twist. The bridge wasn't technically on HOA property. It sat at the edge of the lake, half on county easement, half on private lots, which meant Karen had bulldozed something she didn't even own. At the time, few of us realized it. We just stared at the wreckage, grieving the loss. But the seed of doubt had been planted. That night, as the crickets buzzed and frogs croaked across what used to be a lively crossing, I stood by the shore with a couple of neighbors. The moon shimmered off the water, broken now by jagged posts jutting up like gravestones. "This isn't about safety," one neighbor muttered. This is about control. She wants to be the queen of the lake. And as much as I hated to admit it, he was right. This was less about rotten boards and more about Karen's ego. She couldn't stand a part of the community thriving outside her grip. Destroying the bridge was her way of reminding us that nothing in this neighborhood happened without her say-so. What she didn't realize, though, was that destroying the bridge didn't kill the community. It lit a fire. People who'd never cared about HOA meetings before suddenly wanted to know about bylaws, budgets, and property rights. Every shredded plank floating on the lake was proof that Karen had gone too far. And yet, standing there watching the water carry away the last piece of our bridge, I couldn't shake one question. If she was willing to bulldoze something so beloved, what else would she come for next? We didn't know it then, but the answer was much bigger than a bridge. It was the lake itself. You don't own the lake, Karen. You never did. The words hit like a gunshot in the stale air of the HOA clubhouse. Papers slapped down on the table so hard the coffee mugs rattled, and every head in the room snapped toward the man standing there, Mr. Douglas, the quiet retiree from Lot 12, who usually kept to his garden. Tonight, though, he looked like he'd come to wage war. I swear you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing above us. Karen, perched at the head of the table in her usual pastel blazer, forced a smile so tight it looked painful. "Of course we own the lake," she said sweetly, her knuckles whitening on the arm of her chair. "The HOA owns everything in sight. Everyone here knows that." Except now, everyone wasn't so sure, because in Douglas's trembling hands were photocopies of the original subdivision plat maps and county water rights records. And clear as day, highlighted in neon yellow, were the words, "Lake rights retained by private landowner. HOA jurisdiction, shoreline only." The room erupted. Voices overlapping, chairs scraping, people waving their arms like they were at an auction. "Wait, so she tore down the bridge on land that wasn't hers," someone shouted. "What about the dues we paid for lake maintenance? Where did that money go?" Another demanded. Karen banged her gavel like she was presiding over a courtroom, but the sound only fueled the chaos. And in that moment, I couldn't help but think, this was the real fallout from the bridge. She'd thought she was proving her strength. Instead, she'd lit a match under every neighbor with a grudge and a filing cabinet. The backstory unraveled fast. After the bridge collapsed, people started digging, literally and figuratively. Old minutes from HOA meetings were pulled out of storage boxes. Bylaws were reread like Holy Scripture. Property deeds, some written on onion skin paper from the 70s, made their way around the cul-de-sac. Every page seemed to contradict Karen's iron-fisted narrative. Her authority over the lake never existed. The dam at the far end, the one she claimed was HOA infrastructure that required special assessments, privately owned by a family that had been here since before the subdivision existed. The only thing the HOA ever controlled was a narrow strip of shoreline and the boat dock, yet Karen had been writing checks as if she were queen of the waters. I remembered one meeting where she'd pitched a resort renovation project. She called it Lakewood Luxe, new docks, fancy lighting, paddle boat rentals. She even waved around a glossy brochure she'd clearly printed at the FedEx store. "This will raise property values by 20%, she'd declared. Nobody had the nerve to challenge her then. But now, as Douglas pointed to the dam owner's signature, bold and undeniable, you could feel the tide turning. "Karen," he said, voice steady now, "you've been charging us for something you don't even own." She laughed, a brittle, high-pitched sound. "That's ridiculous. The HOA represents the community, and the lake is part of the community." "But representation isn't ownership," I cut in, surprising myself. "You can't just build or destroy whatever you want on property that doesn't belong to us." Karen's eyes darted, calculating, but she didn't answer. The clubhouse smelled of burnt coffee and copier ink. Ceiling fans stirred the humid air, but the tension was suffocating. Neighbors leaned forward in their folding chairs, eyes flashing, years of swallowed frustration bubbling to the surface. The bridge might have been the spark, but this was the explosion. Then came the moment that shifted everything. One of the younger moms, usually polite to a fault, stood and asked the question nobody wanted to say out loud. If she lied about the lake, what else is she lying about? The silence that followed was louder than any shouting. I looked around and realized we were all thinking the same thing. The special assessments that always seemed to appear out of nowhere. The landscaper who only ever trimmed Karen's hedges properly. The security patrol fee, even though the only patrol car belonged to her nephew. Suddenly, nothing felt safe. Karen finally broke the silence, voice sharp enough to cut glass. If any of you think you can run this HOA better, then by all means, try. But when someone drowns because the dam fails, don't come crying to me. It was a scare tactic, plain and simple. But it didn't land the way she hoped, because Douglas calmly tapped his papers and said, "If the dam fails, it's not your problem to solve. It never was, and the owner might have a few things to say about you pretending otherwise." That was when her smile cracked. Just for a second, but we all saw it. I swear the air shifted. It was like the moment in a play when the villain realizes the audience knows the trick. Karen adjusted her pearls, took a sip of water she didn't need, and tried to pivot to the next agenda item. But the room wasn't with her anymore. People whispered openly, shaking their heads. The power she'd flaunted for years was slipping, one clause and one deed at a time. By the time the meeting adjourned, half the neighbors were buzzing about calling lawyers, and the other half were talking about a recall vote. For once, nobody lingered to chat with Karen. She packed up her folder in silence, her heels clicking sharp against the linoleum as she left. But the most unsettling part came later that night. From my porch, I could see her standing by the lake, staring at the water as if she could will it back under her control. The moon lit her face pale, and for the first time she didn't look smug. She looked cornered, and standing there in the dark, I had a chilling thought. If Karen couldn't own the lake, she'd find another way to destroy it. The first scream came from a child on the resort dock. Then another, shriller, from a woman clutching her sun hat as the water line slid backward like someone was pulling a plug on the whole lake. Fish thrashed in the shallows, paddle boats keeled sideways in mud, and within minutes the lakeside paradise looked like the set of a disaster movie. Neighbors ran out of their houses. Phones shot up in the air like rifles, capturing every second for Facebook. The air smelled of wet clay and algae, sharp and sour, mixing with the metallic tang of panic. And standing there, I realized we were watching the end of Karen's empire. Live, unscripted, and utterly irreversible. The irony, we'd all seen it coming. Not the lake draining itself, maybe, but the fallout. After Douglas exposed that the HOA didn't own the dam, Karen doubled down instead of backing off. She called an emergency board meeting, where she unveiled glossy plans for her so-called Lakewood Lux project. Boardwalk, lights, rental kayaks, the works. She claimed negotiations with the dam owner are ongoing. But nobody had heard a word from the man himself. Turns out he'd heard plenty. The dam belonged to Mr. Whitaker, a grizzled retiree who lived 2 miles downstream and only showed up in town once a month to buy supplies. He was the kind of man who still sharpened his own axe and wore flannel even in July. According to the clerk at the county records office, Whitaker had owned those water rights since the 1960s and guarded them like treasure. When he got wind of Karen's brochures, sent out without his knowledge, complete with lakeside packages for resort guests, he wasn't flattered, he was furious. We didn't know it at the time, but he sent her a letter. A simple 3-sentence warning. Cease claiming authority over my property. The lake level is mine to manage. Consider this your final notice. Karen didn't share that with us. Instead, she strutted around the neighborhood talking about partnerships and investments. She even hosted a champagne mixer by the clubhouse, handing out mock-ups of cabanas and paddle boats. Picture our little community on the cover of a travel magazine," she gushed, clinking glasses. People smiled tightly, but I noticed more than a few slipped away early. The seeds of doubt had grown roots. And then came the morning it happened. I woke to the sound of sirens, but not police. Car alarms from the resort parking lot, all triggered at once. By the time I reached the lake, the scene was chaos. Paddleboats sat crooked in brown puddles. Docks leaned at angles like broken ribs. Fish flopped helplessly, their silver bellies flashing in the sun. The water line had receded so far, kids were running on cracked mud where they used to swim. "What's happening?" someone shouted. "They opened the dam," another cried. And sure enough, at the far end of the lake, a white froth of water surged through the spillway like a beast set free. I spotted Karen then, charging down the path in wedges and pearls, her face blotchy with panic. "This is sabotage," she shrieked. "This is criminal." But even as she barked orders at resort staff, even as she waved her arms and threatened to call the sheriff, everyone knew. This wasn't sabotage. This was consequence. Neighbors didn't rally to help her. They filmed, they whispered, they smiled. One man even live-streamed, narrating like a sports commentator. "And there goes another 10 feet of shoreline, folks. Lakewood Resort, now offering mud-walking tours." I shouldn't have laughed, but I did. The so-called resort guests, mostly weekenders Karen had lured with cheap rentals, were packing cars within the hour. Children cried over lost floaties. Parents cursed as they dragged coolers through muck. By noon, the lake was nothing but a patchy wetland, reeds poking through cracked earth where water had shimmered the day before. And Karen? She refused to accept it. "This is temporary," she snapped at anyone who would listen. "Routine maintenance. They'll refill it tomorrow." But the footage told another story. Within hours, clips of flopping fish and sinking paddleboats flooded social media. HOA Drain's own lake became the joke of the week, even though the truth was far stranger. That evening, we gathered on the brittle, dry lake bed like archaeologists at a dig site. Kids poked at old beer cans, someone found a rusted bicycle, and the smell of rot lingered in the warm air. The sunset reflected not off water, but off cracked, glistening mud. For once, nobody was fighting. We were united by the surreal sight of our lake. Gone. I caught Karen standing near the dock, her shoes sinking in mud, her face pale in the fading light. She muttered to herself, too quiet for me to catch the words, but her hands were shaking. For the first time, she looked small. Not powerful, not smug, just small. But here's the thing about people like Karen. When cornered, they don't surrender. They scheme. And as I watched her march back toward her house, mud streaking her wedges, I had a sickening thought. If she couldn't control the lake anymore, she'd come for something else. Something bigger. And sure enough, the very next week, the letters started arriving in our mailboxes.